I'm just going to look first in my presentation at a qualitative longitudinal research project that I've done with Jane Miller at the University of Bath. And this is, when I was sitting there, I think this is a research with a purpose. And I thought, God, that's so rude. Everybody's research is with a purpose. What are you talking about, Tess? So I don't mean that. What I mean is this research was designed by us to test out a policy assumption in a way. And that policy assumption is that for low-income children, for their parent, for their mother in particular, to be in work at whatever age is uncontested in a way in the policy domain. Okay? We didn't have a position on this, but we did know that there was not evidence, there wasn't enough research evidence out there for us to really understand this process, and particularly to understand it over time. So the project was called became to be called the Family Work Project. It ran in a way from 2003 to 2008 in terms of interviews, but we're still working on the data. We have masses of data, like anybody here who's doing qualitative longitudinal research. But also we are hoping to go back in what was 5 years' time, because one of the things we talked about with our study was where do you imagine you will be in 5 years' time? So given where we find ourselves now, it's a rather important question as well, I think. So the aims of the research were for lone mothers and their children to examine the impact of paid work and for some job loss on their family lives and on their living standards over time, and also to explore how families negotiate the everyday challenges of sustaining low-income employment over time. And this group of families, we started off with 50 lone mothers and 61 children. This group of families were lone mothers who had left income support. Some of them had been on income support for a long time, and they had moved into employment, but they moved into low-wage employment supported by tax credits. Okay. And their children that were interviewed were aged between 8 and 16, and of course some of them all of them got older, but they started off between 8 and 16. And actually we did 3 waves of data so far, and in it the notion at this time was very much to try and get into policy as well as sense of children of active participants within a family setting. And so we came up with this notion of as it developed, and we looked at the data of a family work project, a holistic approach to understanding work in these, the project of work in these households. And as you see, it was funded originally, 2 ways were funded by the ESRC, one of them to do with a fellowship for me. And then the final wave, very interestingly, policy-wise, the Department of Work and Pensions got so interested in the data, they decided to fund a final wave. Now, with that, as you will see, well, you may not see, but one of the things I'm going to look at is what do you do for your funder? What is it they want to hear? What is it they're capable of hearing? And what is it you probably should try and make sure they can hear or do hear? So the policy context, and I'm just going to go quickly through the study because I have very little time, but the policy context is a context which has ratcheted up even more now, but even back then was about activation into work for lone parents. As I say, almost I can't say this with a lisp, unproblematic, it wasn't unproblematic as far as policy was concerned, particularly in the context of high rates of child poverty. And we have, as you probably know, some of the highest rates of child poverty in the minority world. And children were very much conceived in policy as passive care burdens. They were essentially things that needed to be resolved in order to get lone mothers into employment. So all these things were tensions that needed to be thought through in the policy, in the research design. These are just some key findings. I'm not going to dwell on them because I've got other things to say because I'm not looking at this in a way. But just to give you a sense, what some of the things we found, that employment, of course, I sometimes feel good research is about the incredibly obvious, isn't it? That employment affects the whole family, and it affects mothers as well as children. They have changes, both of them, with each other, in time, in space, in money, in everything, okay? And one of the key findings, I think, found was that poverty is such a driver in low-income families in behaviour. It's such a driver about what you're prepared to put up with, what you're prepared to tolerate, what you will do to try and change things, and how you experience change yourself. So poverty, the great elephant in the room, even when you're coming out with good results as far as policy is concerned. Okay, this is a driver. Came out very strongly in the study how active children were in family life, around work and care and everything really. Active participants managing and negotiating change themselves. Low-income employment, we found, was particularly characterised for these women by instability and uncertainty. By the end of 3 waves, we had a smaller sample, but right throughout the time, probably only one of those mothers did not experience some change in their employment, either in hours or days or type of work or in and out of work. So a very fluid environment, and to sustain employment over time, it has to become, it appears, a family practice, a particular way of being. Okay? And we saw considerable change over time as the demands and rewards of employment change, as children age, as relationships evolve, and so on. So, I want to think first about some of the dangers and challenges for us of doing this type of work, and particularly because lone parents, low-income welfare recipients are intensively governed, and there is a sharp interest in them from policy and from the press and media, and so one needs to tread carefully, okay, and be aware of the potential for the mapping of certain issues onto existing moral panics or new moral panics, or it seems to be a new moral panic ready to be created, or an ideological project. So this is not, if any research is, but this research is particularly not a value-free area. Staying true to participants' accounts while speaking such truths to power is actually very challenging and rather difficult. And lone parents and their children are particularly vulnerable to these moral panics, to stigma, to increased and intensive governance as a result of, possibly, of your findings or somebody else's findings. So lone parent is rarely a value-free concern in a policy setting. Findings can be misread, misunderstood, misused, abused. Sorry, I seem to have just focused on the negative there. But anyway, in this field there's a lot of negative. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. I think I've got time, I hope so. And of course, case studies are particularly problematic because as time goes by, people become more identifiable, and we've talked about this already today, both to the state, to others, and to each other. Which, when you're looking at children and mothers, is an issue. This is an example of abused research. There's a welfare reform example, a debate in the House of Lords, and most of this comes directly from Hansard. A debate about Clause 57, compelling lone parents to seek employment, and ending entitlement to income support for lone parents whose youngest child is 5. The research evidence for this, interestingly, includes mine. And this is how it appears. The Minister referred to evidence circulated to the House using findings from our study, the Family Work Project, about how lone parents' employment can provide a good role model to their children. Okay? Yes. Okay. Unfortunately for the Minister, he hadn't accounted for Ruth Lister, who's a fine woman, who came back and said, however, the research also found that's not always the case, which of course it did find that. One of the researchers, blah, blah, encouraging lone mothers into unstable and insecure labour markets runs the risk of alienating children from the values of employment. For these children, work had held out the promise of something better, and this is the value of longitudinal work. They really believed it, just as mothers did at one point, many of them. They held out the promise of something better, and that promise has not been kept. So they also experienced disappointment, and for some, a gradual, I would say, an apparent loss of confidence in the value of work. So in actual fact, the opposite, almost, of what had been claimed. So care with your research and keeping an eye on how it appears. Okay, so I've called this bit the temporal web, and then afterwards I thought, well, there probably is a phrase, the temporal web, and it means something completely different. But what I was interested in this is this notion of who to tell, and what to cover up, and I want to look at mothers and children, and also the funder, and in this case is the state. And the interesting things about, to me, the web of time that you involve in, that time brings familiarity, it generates trust, of course, it forges relationships between previous strangers, it invites confidences. And as you listen, I did all of these interviews over time, so I'm aware that as you listen with care, that the space, the QLR space grows, it grows outward. And we've already had some talk about this, about on the phone, on the internet, but also when you arrive, have a cup of tea, catch up, then you do, and then when you're going, that bit spreads out as well, you learn more and more, you hear more and more, or as somebody once said to me, I've got nothing to hide, and actually they patently did have a few things to hide. And so you find yourself in this environment where you hear people's hopes, you hear the whispered thing, you hear people's secrets, their future plans, their relationships, their past pains, their present fears, their hidden strategies of survival. And these things come to you because as mothers and children come to know me, they tell me more, and not expecting it to be mined by others later, of course. And it's very difficult to explain to someone that would be the case, and that's something perhaps to discuss about at another time, later. So the intimate stranger that starts off the intimate conversation with a stranger is subverted and inverted and becomes an intimate conversation with a seeming friend. So some interesting issues there for me, and also particularly for me, the challenge of researching actually in people's homes with mothers and with children. Okay, sometimes mothers first, sometimes children first, sometimes one child first, any old, whichever suits anybody, but it's very varied. But there are real ethics of confidentiality here between mothers and children. This is one of the really sensitive areas about employment, and it was so interesting this morning to hear about mothers and childcare and employment, and the kind of charge there around that. And of course there was a massive charge and anxiety around work and employment, and both mothers and children were very concerned. Over time it went both ways because there are so many changes. So children, you see, have many things to hide from their mothers, that they don't like their childcare, that they're managing and moderating their needs and still going without things to try and help things manage, that they're going to school where they're unwell because their mothers will lose a day's pay if they don't, that they dislike new partners, that they feel unhappy about changes in family practices and changes in family time. But these are not things that children are telling me to tell their mothers. They're things that they're sharing with me. But they've also got things that they want to know because they're very anxious about their mother's health. And one of the things in our study was how apparent it was that women's health declined over time, really declined over time in terms of stress and depression. They want to know about issues at work and what's going on at work. They want to know about their mother's relationships, new partners or boyfriends. They want to know about, is there enough money? They want to know about debt. And equally, mothers have things they want to know about their children. Are their children happy? Is their work okay? Is it working all right? Is their childhood okay? Are they having a good time? Do they like new partners? Are they unhappy about money? Are they worried about their work? Are they still affected by domestic violence? All these issues have come up. And they also have things to hide. Poor health, which they don't want their children to know about. Being bullied at work, disturbingly common. Their future plans, what they think they might do, but they don't want to announce it to their child or children at this point in time. Debt, increasing debt, more debt, worrying debt, not things to be shared. And yet, of course, perversely, when you listen to parents and children, when you listen to children, children are so deeply knowing, and low-income children are very, very knowing about things like debt and money and worry and fear. So there are real challenges there. And then, of course, over time, in your study, as your data goes on, as it generates over time, it becomes more complex, even more complex, messier, incoherent in places. And in this particular arena of policy, this is a real challenge. Mapping low income over time is a real challenge because not everybody can sustain employment, and there are lots of reasons why people might not be able to. And getting that message across in the ways in which it can be heard and understood is challenging, because low income family life is so often stereotyped and it's devalued. And I can't tell you the times when I may have gone to the Treasury or gone to the Department of Work and Pension or British Child Poverty and given a presentation, and somebody has asked me, or people have asked me, questions directly contrary to what they've just heard, because they cannot hear what I've just said. And that's very, very challenging. And the other thing is, of course, family life is so fluid and changing. So with these particular families, as work is so fluid and changing, and then family life is so fluid and changing, we've got like a constant, it's like being in a kind of a vortex of things going around all the time. As lone parenthood, for a start, is not, contrary to the Daily Mail, it's not a static state. People do partner, repartner, and change their relationships. Low-income finances are often in flux and change. Somebody can be doing well one time when I see them and then doing very badly the next time. Work is unstable, as we've said, and changeable. Children come and go. New children come, and the children that are there might fall out with their parents and go. And when the children fall out with their parents and go, debt can often arrive because you're relying on a benefit that was attached to that child that came into the house when you extended your loan to do your house up because you've now got work. Okay, so it's immensely complicated. And children have their own strategies of survival. They negotiate, they manage low-income life and family change, and much of that is hidden. So making that apparent whilst not breaching confidentiality is also a big issue. And of course, the state just does not do messy. Okay? It doesn't understand that. So there needs to be clarity come out of this with insight into everyday life and the challenges that presents, low-income employment presents for mothers and children. You need to be able, I think, to reveal complexity and diversity in people's lives, but certainly for me in this field, you must be aware of the dangers of stereotyping and that families are seen as chaotic, not trying hard enough, not resilient enough, one of my great bête noirs, resilience, or not in some way doing enough, being the right people, because of this great weight of pathological expectations. And this changes over time, as we'll see. So my last reflections, I started off this project with Jane with a policy dilemma, a policy drive that was happening, and that policy drive has only accelerated. It is now really accelerating for people on welfare benefits and particularly lone mothers. And each successive wave of data when we go out, and I hope we'll go out again, encounters change. And I know you've already covered this many times, but it always strikes me as so important that there are changes in people's lives, in their relationships, in their place, in their work, in their health. There are changes in me. There are so many changes to account for. But critically, perhaps with this population of respondents, there are changes in policy. And there are changes in government. And there are changes in government foci. Okay, so it is not, when you do policy research over time, actually what you start off to do may be very different from what you find yourself doing and trying to make sense of as you go along, because there can be significant changes. And we are at this moment in time in a period of really significant welfare retrenchment. and change. And so what is happening in those women's lives is incredibly significant at this point in time, and what will happen to them in relation to policy is important, I think. And my final thought is, for me, is that research findings are not as ephemeral as maybe not we like to imagine them go on forever, but they're not as ephemeral as we might think, because of course they endure and can be reproduced and reanimated and map on to shifting political and ideological terrains. So these are very sensitive areas that one treads on in order to try and speak truth that you feel that you have been privileged to share.